So this group of plants are grouped together by their their growth strategy, really. So they can be found in a variety of habitats. These are plants in the vine category. So I'm calling them climbers and creepers. Vines, if you remember, this was a form of habit. And habit was whether plants were herbaceous or woody. And vines are kind of in the middle of herbaceous and woody. There are woody vines and there are herbaceous vines, and they're more defined by how they grow relative to their environment, more defined by that instead of how their particular cells are put together. So you can have a viney plant that twines along a woody plant in its environment. You can have viney plants that are twining up herbaceous plants. And really the definition of a vine is that it uses another structure to get itself up. So it grows with support of another structure. So often in the environment, that is a tree or a herbaceous plant. Just the same as you have trees as a more obvious choice to climb up in a herbaceous habitat like a prairie, you can also have vines that do pretty well to climb up the herbaceous plants in their vicinity. So it's a nice little trade-off. The plant gets to trade off the energy it requires to build support tissues, such as this tree has a lot of structure put into the trunk of this tree, built up over many years. The vine can get up to a higher height, get better access to light higher up off the ground, and it can get there in a shorter amount of time with a lot less structure being built. So not necessarily hurting any of these plants that they're growing up. They're not parasites or anything like that. Not at least by definition. Some of them could be parasites, but they just have this strategy to kind of take advantage of structures in their environment and save on growth tissue. So kind of defined it there. Advantages, I think we've pretty well gone over those. So plants growing up a structure. You can see here a nice delicate stem on this morning glory plant. It's growing around this, looks like a stake in a garden maybe. So it's a woody structure that someone has put there, or at least a stiff structure. And this plant is twined around it and gotten high off the ground with a rather delicate stem. So it's not a sturdy enough stem to support that plant. So what do you need for adaptations to do this kind of growth? Well, having really kind of a plant behavior that allows you to respond to the environment. So locate places that are good to climb up, and then have adaptations that allow you to do the climbing. So we'll see this as, I like breaking these down into manageable concepts. So I like to consider our vines as vines that are stem twining, and then other ones that have adaptations like tendrils that allow them to grip onto their environment. So a few members of these stem twining groups. These are not, a couple of these are not widespread stem twiners in their families. So this family Polygonaceae has plenty of upright herbaceous plants. And you wouldn't really look at that family and say that it's mostly stem twiners, but there are some here. This is one that's doing a nice job, and this is a weed you might encounter. Black bindweed is what it's called. Another one over here, Fabaceae. This is the bean family. So you might in your garden have beans or peas that do some twining, but this family also has really big diversity in its growth forms. So you can have woody plants all the way up to trees in Fabaceae, and most of them are not doing this twining. So I want to mention them here. If you're encountering them in the field, these are groups to know about as possible members of the stem twining group, not necessarily widespread in the family. This other family here, Convolvulaceae, I would say is more of a habitual stem twining family, and it's kind of built into the name. So Convolvulaceae, I mean, it's named for the genus called Convolvulus, but that name actually comes from Latin for basically, like revolving. Convolving is going around something, so it's named for this ability to grow around a structure. And we'll start off with that one. So Convolvulaceae includes a group that we'll talk about, which is actually a group of parasitic plants in this genus Cuscuta. So that's former family Cuscutaceae, and that plant is now in this family, Convolvulaceae. These are herbaceous plants. We do have, as I mentioned, woody vines, but the stem twiners is a lot of herbaceous stem twiners. Alternate leaves, simple leaves, and something, if you need something to look for in this group in the vegetative fashion, having these lobes on the leaves, this is a common feature of this family. So here's the attachment point for the petiole, and then these big lobes heading backwards. Lots of different leaf shape, but the lobes are often present. The flowers are very distinctive. There are these funnel shapes, and they have a fused corolla. So the petals are fused to each other. That's highlighted in our floral formula here. So fused of 5 petals. You don't really see the units because the tip of this funnel is just a nice round bit. It's hard to see that it has really separated out into petals, but you can tell with these pleats in here, kind of the folds. There's this 5-pointed star shape going on there. So that tells us the 5 units that are fused together to make up the corolla. And then other kind of standard floral features there. The fruits become capsules at maturity, so helpful feature to know for this group. So I mentioned Cuscuta. This is pictured here, a couple of images of this parasitic plant. It's a parasite of plants. So it takes nutrients from plants, and it has this curious feature that we often find in parasites where it's lost the ability to do its own photosynthesis. And instead it takes on this interesting creepy orange color, and it steals the nutrients from the plants that are doing photosynthesis. So it gets to be a bit of a problem sometimes, but kind of a nice tie-in also. This is a plant that twines around plants and kind of burrows into them and steals their nutrients. But for the most part, the plants that we're covering as vines, they're not parasites. So you can kind of see maybe an ancestral advantage if you're already twining around a plant. This plant group has figured out how to steal nutrients while twining around plants. So bindweed, daughter. Economically, there is the sweet potato in this group. This is a not too distant relative of regular potato. But this one is, of course, more of a viney plant, and these are sweet potatoes here. I have a little note on here that sweet potatoes are not yams. Globally and botanically, we like not to call these yams. There's another group that actually are the yams. That's actually a monocot group. This is a eudicot group. It's still very important, economically important plant, and it has a kind of an interesting history where there are questions still about the ancestral dispersal of this plant group. The ancient sweet potato across the Pacific Ocean was kind of featured among ocean-faring humans in long time in the past. So this is an investigation in the wild relatives of sweet potatoes, kind of investigating what this shows is the highest diversity. So a number of taxa, most diverse parts of this genus are in Central America there. So just by contrast, yams are in this monocot group. We actually have a local yam, but otherwise these are much more tropical. This is in Africa, and a little bit different. If you're familiar with sweet potatoes and what often gets sold as yams in where we live in the country, this is a much different plant. So actual yams, if you want to make the split on the common name, this kind of yam in this monocot group can be enormous, long tubers, still similar strategy, very similar kind of structure, starchy underground nutrient storage structure, but in a whole different plant family. So here's an illustration of where you can find yams, major food item for folks in West Africa, New Guinea, interestingly enough. And a nice little pun here. You can ask a yam, what's for dinner? And it says, I yam. All right, I did mention we have one of these locally. You can actually find this genus Dioscorea, which is in monocot family Dioscoriaceae. You can find this one in Wisconsin, but it's more diverse toward the tropics. And this one's a little hard to find in Wisconsin. I stumbled upon one once, it was kind of interesting. Nice monocot features there. So leaves maybe kind of reminiscent of Convolvulaceae with these lobes, but the monocot venation, this parallel venation, is very helpful for this group. And there we have our Dioscorea villosa, pretty abundant in Wisconsin and then other places in the country where you can find it. All right, so those were our stem twiners. I mentioned a couple families that have stem twining, but otherwise, we'll cover those families later. So we'll cover Fabaceae, the bean family. We'll cover that later. We'll cover Polygonaceae, the knotweed family, later.